So, Shakespeare has written his poem, Venus and Adonis, and his old school friend Richard Field has agreed to publish it. But there wasn't really much money to be made from publishing poetry. There never really has been, and there wasn't a fully commercial market in secular literature at this time. So the way in which a writer could make money out of poetry was patronage. That is to say, the writer would find a wealthy man or woman, usually an aristocrat, and ask them if they could dedicate their work to them. This would involve writing a very flowery introduction, a dedicatory epistle or letter, praising the patron for their great good taste, for their support for the arts, and for all their other qualities. In return for this, the writer would hope to be given a small payment, the idea being that from the aristocrat's point of view, it would look good to be supporting the creative arts. The other possibility that might come further down the line would be that the patronage of a particular work might lead to a more developed relationship with the patron. Perhaps having proved himself as a writer, the poet might get a job as a secretary or a tutor in the household of the patron. The patron that Shakespeare identified for Venus and Adonis was this man, the Earl of Southampton. Several writers were targeting Southampton at this time, 1593. They knew that he was about to come into his majority, to turn the age of 21, and they assumed that this would mean he would come into a great fortune and be able to give out all sorts of positions, to give something more than the guinea or so he might pay in return for a single dedication. We don't know the exact circumstances in which Shakespeare met Southampton, in which he got Southampton's agreement for the dedication of Venus and Adonis. There is some circumstantial evidence that what may have happened is that when the theatres were closed because of plague in the period 1593 to 94, Shakespeare might have spent some time in the Earl of Southampton's household at Titchfield, which is down on the south coast of England, in the county of Hampshire. Certainly, aristocrats would get out of town when there was an outbreak of plague, and it's possible that the relationship began there and that Shakespeare did indeed have some sort of a position, perhaps as some kind of secretary to Southampton. We just don't know. But Southampton was an extremely handsome, charismatic figure. This portrait is painted a number of years later, when he's been through a considerable trauma, but one can still see his long flowing locks and his air of fine chivalric demeanour. Some scholars believe that Shakespeare started writing his sonnets, addressing them to the Earl of Southampton. Perhaps Southampton is the fair youth, the beautiful boy described in the sonnets. Some even believe that there might have been a love affair between Southampton and Shakespeare. We certainly know from other evidence that Southampton was alleged to have bisexual tendencies. The portrait here shows Southampton confined in the Tower of London. You can see it's not quite as elegant a room as you might first imagine when you look at it. The glass is cracked. Southampton himself is a little the worse for wear. His arm is in a sling. So what was Southampton doing in the Tower? Well, the answer is that he became very close to the Earl of Essex, who was Queen Elizabeth's favourite, and led the Elizabethan army against the rebels in Ireland. Southampton was his right-hand man on the Irish campaign. But then Essex and Elizabeth fell out. Essex attempted a coup d'etat. He marched against the Queen's court. Southampton was with him at the time. Essex was sentenced to death and duly executed. Southampton was confined in the Tower, stripped of his title. When King James came to the throne in 1603, Southampton was released, and it's possible that this portrait was taken to around the time of his release, or soon after, to commemorate the time that he was in the Tower. He's accompanied by his loyal cat. There's a story which dates, I think, from a later period, that this really was Southampton's cat who managed to find his way to the Tower to go down a chimney and join his master. That may well be an apocryphal invention, a piece of myth-making, but it's intended, but the position of the cat in the portrait is intended to suggest something about loyalty. Southampton is saying, I am loyal to the king, I am not a traitor. But by this time, Southampton's name was dangerous. He was, in a sense, a tarnished patron. Shakespeare had begun to make his way as a writer by dedicating Venus and Adonis and then a second poem, The Rape of Lucrece, to Southampton. But by 1603, when his acting company had become the King's Men, they needed to look elsewhere for patronage. And so it was that Shakespeare's acting company turned to another beautiful young man, the Earl of Pembroke, who was a loyal follower of King James. He had indeed been one of the English lords who rode to Scotland to tell James that Elizabeth had died, and James was now to take the throne of England as well as that of Scotland. I've got here in the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust a fantastic relic. We don't actually know this is authentic, but a great 19th century Shakespeare scholar and collector called Halliwell Phillips believed that it was. And it says on it, the hair of Pembroke, aged 20 years. It's quite fair. To what extent it's just faded in time, we don't know. But Pembroke was another beautiful youth. Those scholars who believe that Shakespeare's sonnets were written rather later in his career would say that they were for Pembroke, not Southampton, and that Pembroke was the fair youth. So what I might be holding in my hand here is a lock of the lovely boy's hair. It's an amazing thought. Regardless of whether the sonnets were written for Pembroke, there is no doubt that the Earl of Pembroke did provide patronage and support to Shakespeare's acting company. And this was to be of enormous importance after Shakespeare's death, because it was Pembroke and his brother, the Earl of Montgomery, who were the patrons for the great book, The First Folio, in which Shakespeare's plays were collected by his fellow actors. Without that book, half of Shakespeare's plays would never have survived. And that too has a dedicatory epistle. So the whole structure of both playwriting and the publishing of literature, whether poetry like Venus and Adonis or poetic plays like the works in the First Folio, depended on this bond, this relationship with the aristocracy. The higher reaches of society were enormously important for Shakespeare, even though he could write perfectly capably of ordinary people and with great insight of the corruption that can take place in the higher reaches of society. But he was always walking a tightrope. He didn't want to toady, to kowtow to his patrons, but he did know that he had to please them in his writing and his playwriting.